The introduction of the British Aerospace Sea Harrier variant, informally known to its crews as the Shar, in particular took place in 1979, and not a moment too soon, as the Falklands War broke out a mere 3 years later. The Harrier warbird in turn takes its name from a flesh and blood bird of prey, namely several species of diurnal hawks belonging to the Cercinae subfamily and the Circus genus. The Sea Harrier served in the Falklands War and the Balkans conflicts. On all occasions it mainly operated from aircraft carriers positioned within the conflict zone. The British Royal Navy Sea Harrier is one of the best fighter planes of all time. I stand by that choice, and let me explain why. The British Aerospace Sea Harrier is a naval short takeoff and vertical takeoff and landing jet fighter, reconnaissance and attack aircraft. It is the second member of the Harrier family developed. It first entered service with the Royal Navy in April 1980 as the Sea Harrier FRS-1 and became informally known as the Shar. Unusual in an era in which most naval and land-based air superiority fighters were large and supersonic. The principal role of the subsonic Sea Harrier was to provide air defense for Royal Navy task groups centered around the aircraft carriers. The Sea Harrier served in the Falklands War and the Balkans conflicts. On all occasions it mainly operated from aircraft carriers positioned within the conflict zone. Its usage in the Falklands War was its most high-profile and important success, when it was the only fixed-wing fighter available to protect the British task force. The Sea Harriers shot down 20 enemy aircraft during the conflict. 2 Sea Harriers were lost to enemy ground fire. They were also used to launch ground attacks in the same manner as the Harriers operated by the Royal Air Force. The Sea Harrier was marketed for sales abroad, but India was the only other operator after attempts to sell the aircraft to Argentina and Australia were unsuccessful. A second, updated version for the Royal Navy was made in 1993 as the Sea Harrier FA-2. Improving its air-to-air abilities and weapons compatibilities, along with a more powerful engine. This version was manufactured until 1998. The aircraft was withdrawn from service early by the Royal Navy in 2006, but remained in service with the Indian Navy for a further decade until its retirement in 2016. My justification for including the Sea Harrier on a top 5 list years back to the exclusion of the F-4 Phantom and the Sukhoi Su-27 Flanker was the plane's incredible 23-0 air-to-air kill ratio in the hands of Britain's Fleet Air Arm against Argentine Air Force opponents during the 1982 Falklands War, thus playing a key role in the UK's ultimate victory. In the past, I have stated that the Sea Harrier is one of the best fighter planes of all time. I stand by that choice, and let me explain why. For the record, 2 Sea Harriers were lost to enemy ground fire. Thus, the Sea Harrier is one of only 3 jet fighter aircraft that is unbeaten in air-to-air combat, along with the F-15 Eagle and the aforementioned Su-27. And as I previously argued, in my professional opinion, the flanker's 6-0 score isn't a big enough statistical sample to merit a top 5 ranking. The Harrier pilots, which launched from the decks of the Royal Navy aircraft carriers HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible, pulled off this remarkable feat whilst tangling with the Argentines' A-4 Skyhawk, which was no slouch in the air combat department by any means, as demonstrated by the latter's destruction of Royal Navy and Royal Fleet auxiliary surface ships such as destroyer HMS Coventry, RFA Sir Galahad and HMS Antelope, the latter loss producing arguably the most dramatic photograph from the conflict, though not to the same extent as the F-14 Tomcat and FA-18 Hornet in the Top Gun film franchise. The Harrier even got its moment in the cinematic sun, thanks to Arnold Schwarzenegger in the 1994 James Cameron action-adventure True Lies. Appropriately, the Harrier warbird in turn takes its name from a flesh and blood bird of prey, namely several species of diurnal hawks belonging to the Cercinae subfamily and the Circus genus. The first generation of the Harrier Jump Jets was the Hawker Siddeley Harrier, which made her maiden flight in December 1967 and entered service in April 1969, thus revolutionizing the concept of vertical short takeoff and landing capabilities for fixed-wing attack aircraft. The introduction of the British Aerospace Sea Harrier variant, informally known to its crews as the Shar, in particular took place in 1979, and not a moment too soon, as the Falklands War broke out a mere 3 years later. Eerily, at the time of the Sea Harrier's introduction, the Fleet Air Arm had actually been completely lacking a fixed-wing fighter. Retired Lieutenant Commander David Morgan, who downed 2 Skyhawks and 1.5 Puma helicopters, making him the most successful British fighter pilot of the conflict and received the Distinguished Service Cross for his accomplishments, had much to say about the Sea Harrier's operations. We knew that we had to provide not only air cover for the fleet, but also once we got troops ashore, we knew that the Argentine Air Force was able to provide something in the region of 140 fast jet aircraft. So we needed to put ourselves between the Argentine Air Force and the troops on the ground if we were going to have any hope of retaking the islands. The Sea Harrier variant saw additional combat in the Balkans against Serbian ground forces, both during Operations Deny Flight and Deliberate Force over Bosnia and Operation Allied Force over Kosovo. One Sea Harrier was downed by a Serb SAM during Deny Flight, but its pilot, then Lieutenant Nick Richardson, safely ejected and was lucky enough to land in territory controlled by friendly Bosnian Muslims. A total of 98 airframes were built. Surprisingly, the Sea Harrier variant was unable to gain any foreign customers other than the Indian Navy, which acquired its first 3 such warbirds in 1983. However, other variants of the Harrier, such as the AV-8A and AV-8B Harrier II, blasted their way to fame in the hands of the U.S. Marine Corps. One of the few examples of the U.S. Marine Corps buying foreign, especially in the aircraft category, and thus paving the way to appear in the Schwarzenegger movie. The Royal Navy retired its Sea Harriers in 2006, and the Indian Navy's White Tigers Squadron followed suit in 2016. Several surviving Sea Harriers are displayed in multiple museums in India and the UK, including the Naval Aviation Museum India in Goa. The only stateside craft I'm aware of is the one owned by Knowles Aviation, owned and operated by retired U.S. Marine Corps aviator Art Knowles, which also holds the distinction of being the world's only civilian-owned and privately flown Harrier of any kind in the world.